For a moment there, this looked like the kind of story that can spiral into a political and military nightmare. An American aircrew goes down inside Iran, one man is recovered, the other disappears into hostile territory, and suddenly the question is no longer just what happened in the air. It becomes a test of rescue doctrine, of air superiority, of deception, of escalation, and of how far the United States is actually willing to go when one of its own is stranded behind enemy lines. Now we know the missing officer has been pulled out, but the rescue itself may be even more revealing than the crash that made it necessary, because this was not some simple pickup in a quiet corner of the map.
Dramatic pause. If the early reporting is even broadly correct, what unfolded involved encrypted survival beacons, air cover, misinformation operations, direct clashes with Iranian forces, American aircraft losses, and US personnel physically entering Iranian territory to get the job done. And once you step back from the drama of the extraction itself, bigger questions start to emerge. How safe are US flight operations over Iran really? What does this tell us about future rescue missions? What tricks could each side use the next time an aircraft goes down? And does this operation mean Washington is sliding towards something larger on the ground? Or is that reading way too much into one fast-moving mission? The chain of events appears to begin on April 3rd when an F-15 went down in Iran near the northern end of the Gulf. Reports suggest it may have been hit by some form of Iranian interceptor, though that part of the story still deserves caution. One crew member, the pilot, was recovered quickly. We do not have a perfect explanation for why that recovery happened so fast, but the simplest one is usually the best. He likely came down in an area that was relatively secure, and American forces or allied assets were able to get to him before Iranian units could close in. The second man, the weapons system officer, was not so lucky. He ejected as well, but he remained missing, and that is what turned this from a bad incident into a two-day crisis. Now, before going further, it is worth saying out loud that Iran has pushed its own version of events, including claims that this rescue either failed or never happened the way it has been described. But a lot of those claims are floating around in an environment already packed with propaganda, anonymous amplification accounts, and information warfare. So the best we can do is stick to what seems most plausible from the reporting available and keep in mind that some details may shift as better information emerges.
What seems to have happened first is that the missing officer activated his Combat Survivor Evader Locator, or CSEL. That matters more than it may sound. This is not just a distress signal in the old-fashioned sense. Older emergency beacons had a serious weakness. They could effectively announce a location to anyone listening. That is a terrible feature when the people trying to find you include both your rescuers and the enemy. The CSEL was designed to reduce that problem by using encrypted, burst-style transmissions, allowing US search and rescue systems to locate downed personnel without broadcasting a clean trail for hostile forces to follow. After landing, the officer reportedly moved into elevated terrain and hit along a ridgeline around 7,000 feet up. That alone tells you something about the environment. This is not flat desert where everyone can see everything.
The terrain in parts of Iran is brutal, layered, and naturally defensive. In fact, these same mountain systems helped frustrate Iraq's invasion of Iran decades ago. Geography is not just background scenery here. It shapes the options for both the person hiding and the people trying to recover him. And here is where the real strategic problem comes in. Knowing where your missing officer is does not automatically mean you can safely go get him. In fact, rescue can become the very thing that gives him away. Imagine a helicopter moving toward a suspected hiding point, then suddenly veering off because the landing zone is too dangerous. Anyone watching from the ground now has a pretty good idea where to start looking, so even when the Americans knew where their officer was, the challenge was not simply navigation. The challenge was reaching him without handing the Iranian side a giant flashing arrow. That helps explain why the gap between location and extraction appears to have stretched on. What seems to have unfolded from Friday into Saturday was not a single straight-line rescue attempt, but a layered operation. There was real air cover to shield the downed officer. There were apparent diversionary movements to pull attention away from his true position. There are also reports that the CIA helped seed misleading narratives inside Iran in an effort to send enemy forces chasing the wrong trail. One of the more interesting claims is that Iranian units were nudged toward the idea that the officer was moving by ground convoy. Whether that exact story was central or just one piece of the deception, the larger idea makes sense. If you cannot extract immediately, you buy time by making the other side search in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, the battlefield still had to be shaped. The rescue window did not really open until enough Iranian personnel had been forced back, pinned down, or eliminated to reduce the immediate risk around the officer's position. A-10 Warthogs reportedly played a major role in that phase, which would fit their reputation for low-altitude support and direct pressure on ground threats. The forces engaged appear to have included elements of the IRGC, which means this was not just a game of hide-and-seek, it was an active combat environment, and the rescue had to be earned before it could be executed.
Then, before dawn on Sunday, the operation seems to have shifted from containment to extraction. According to early accounts, SEAL Team 6 was involved in the final pickup. The picture is still incomplete, but the broad outline is compelling. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft moved into the area. The commandos reached the ground. Suppressive fire kept Iranian forces at distance. The missing officer was recovered, and the team got out. Clean in concept, extremely hard in reality. One of the strangest and most revealing details is the report that two C-130s were unable to depart after attempting to leave Iranian territory.
Curious. If that detail is accurate, it suggests something extraordinary. For at least a short period, the United States had effectively created a temporary operating strip or improvised airhead inside Iran solely for the mission. And when those aircraft could not get back out, additional planes reportedly had to come in, while the stranded C-130s were destroyed to keep them from falling intact into Iranian hands. That is the kind of detail that turns a rescue story into a much larger statement about reach, risk tolerance, and logistical audacity. Just as important, no US fatalities were reported in the operation itself. So yes, the headline is that the officer was rescued, but if that is all someone takes away from this, they are missing the deeper lesson, because the next wave of commentary is going to be filled with certainty, and certainty is usually where analysis goes to die. Some people will treat this as proof that everything is under control. Others will portray it as evidence that the war is on the edge of exploding into something dramatically larger. The reality is less convenient than either extreme. The better way to think about this is through process rather than isolated outcomes. A successful rescue does not mean the system is flawless. A downed aircraft does not mean the system is collapsing. What matters is the broader pattern producing these events. And on that front, the picture remains surprisingly favorable for the United States, though not risk-free. As of mid-March, the US military had reportedly flown around 6,000 sorties over Iran. We do not have a clean current number, but a cautious estimate might put the total closer to 10,000 by now. If enemy action has brought down 3 American aircraft over that stretch, then the implied failure rate is around 0.03%. That is an incredibly low number. It suggests that US air operations are still functioning at a very high level, and that American control of the air remains overwhelming by ordinary wartime standards.
But overwhelming does not mean perfect. Domination is not the same thing as immunity. A 0.03% loss rate is still not zero. If you run enough missions, the math catches up eventually. Another aircraft may well go down, and next time the circumstances could be worse. Maybe the crash happens closer to hostile units. Maybe the terrain is less forgiving. Maybe the pilot or WSO is located by Iran first. Maybe there is no clean rescue window. That is why political leaders in Washington cannot treat this mission like a magic eraser. A successful extraction does not remove the long-term danger of having more Americans shot down over hostile territory.
For context, even rough historical comparisons are revealing. Reliable combat loss statistics are always messy, but if Russia's aircraft loss rate during the first month of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.5% to 1.5%, then the US air campaign over Iran is operating at a vastly lower level of attrition. That does not mean the two wars are identical, they are not, but it does mean the current American air picture, judged strictly by losses, remains much stronger than many people probably realize. Now, there is another layer to this that gets even more interesting when you think a few moves ahead. What happens the next time an American aviator goes down inside enemy territory? Because once both sides have lived through one of these episodes, they start learning from it. From Iran's perspective, capturing a US service member alive would be a propaganda jackpot. Everyone understands that. But the most obvious use of a prisoner may not actually be the smartest immediate use. If Iranian forces ever got to a downed aviator first, one possible move would be not to announce it right away. Instead, they could keep quiet. Let Washington believe the missing airman is still hiding somewhere, waiting for extraction. Let the United States launch rescue efforts, air cover, diversion flights, and follow-on movements. In other words, turn the missing person into bait. If American planners start stretching procedures under time pressure, that could create opportunities for additional ambushes, more aircraft losses, or a cascading operational mess. There was some speculation that this kind of chain reaction might already have been underway before the rescue finally succeeded, though hindsight makes that look less persuasive. More importantly, the viability of that Iranian strategy depends on one thing that still looks shaky: a genuinely effective ability to keep bringing down American aircraft. And so far, a success rate of roughly 0.03% from Tehran's point of view does not exactly inspire confidence. The United States, of course, has a mirror image option. Imagine an alternative scenario where the missing officer had been recovered quietly, and the US somehow kept that fact concealed for a period of time. In practice, that might be difficult because Washington leaks like a screen door on a submarine, but as a concept, it is fascinating. If Iran still believes an aviator is hiding in the field, then Iranian units may expose themselves trying to be first to the prize. They move, they search, they communicate, they reveal patterns. What looked like a rescue mission becomes a trap for the hunters. The reported CIA misinformation campaign may have gestured in that direction already, but you can imagine a much bigger version of the same game.
And then we get to the issue that always grabs headlines faster than it grabs nuance: boots on the ground. The fact that US personnel appear to have entered Iranian territory has triggered the kind of breathless reaction you would expect in the modern media environment. For some people, this becomes instant proof that America has crossed a line and that a larger ground war is only a matter of time. That interpretation is dramatic, but it does not hold up very well once you think through what actually made this operation work. The rescue succeeded, to the extent that it did, because it was fast, narrow, and mission-specific. Speed was not some nice bonus. Speed was the whole point. The moment American troops are on the ground in a hostile state, the clock is already running. The longer they stay, the more likely they are to be tracked, fixed, and hit.
Iran does not need to defeat US forces in open maneuver warfare to make that dangerous. It only needs enough awareness and enough strike capability to send Shahed drones or other assets toward a known position. A quick snatch and exit mission is one thing. Sustained presence is something else entirely. That is why arguments that this rescue somehow opens the door to a ground invasion near Tehran are deeply unserious. They collapse under the weight of geography alone before you even get to supply lines, force protection, command structure, or the enormous resource demands of offensive land warfare. Iran is not a tiny coastal enclave where you improvise a raid and accidentally end up occupying the capital. Anyone making that leap is confusing tactical insertion with strategic conquest. The Pentagon likely understands that perfectly well, which is one reason the overall US ground footprint in the region remains limited. And there is another political constraint here too. Trump, whatever else one wants to say about him, has shown little appetite for large conventional ground commitments of the old Iraq-style variety. So if Washington were truly preparing to shift into something far more expansive on land, that would require a major policy turn, not just a continuation of current trends. That said, there are still smaller, more surgical possibilities worth discussing. Karg Island is an obvious example because people keep pointing to it as a potential target. The simplistic version of the argument goes like this: the US has now shown it can land forces in Iranian territory, so maybe next it seizes Karg and takes control of the oil. But that last part does not really make sense. You do not just take the oil there like grabbing cash from a register. The oil reaches the island through pipelines, and Iran could shut those flows down. Even if it did not, loading and removing that oil under combat conditions would be a logistical mess. And American troops sitting on the island would be obvious targets.
The more realistic concern is not seizure for profit, it is sabotage for disruption. US forces would not need to hold Karg for long or try to operate it as an asset. If they ever went there, the practical military purpose would be to damage export infrastructure, inflict economic pain, and leave. That is a very different concept from occupation. It is still escalatory, it still carries risk. It would almost certainly hit oil markets hard, but it is far more plausible than the fantasy of America casually planting a flag and pumping Iranian crude for itself. So where does all of this leave us? First, it reinforces something that is already widely understood inside military circles, even if it is often flattened in public discussion. US special operations capabilities remain exceptional. Not mythical, not perfect, not cost-free, but exceptional.
Second, it suggests that the broader air campaign is likely to continue under basically the same cautious logic as before. A successful rescue is not a reason to get reckless. If anything, it is a reminder of how much has to go right to clean up a single failure. Third, both Washington and Tehran now have a live example to study, and that means the next behind enemy lines scenario could involve even more deception, even more manipulation, and even more attempts to bait the other side into a mistake. These incidents are not just military events, they are contests in narrative control, timing, and misdirection. And finally, this operation should not be treated as proof that boots on the ground are suddenly safe, easy, or politically sustainable inside Iran. That would be the laziest possible possible conclusion. A lightning extraction in a compressed time window is not the same thing as a durable ground strategy. Those are two different worlds. The broader lesson, as usual, is that leaders and governments will try to package events in the most flattering way possible. They will claim success, control, inevitability, wisdom, all the familiar things, but statements are not reality, announcements are not analysis, and the people who can separate the two are usually the ones who see the next turn in the story before everyone else does. So yes, one American officer is home, but the real significance of this episode is not just that a rescue happened, it is that in the middle of a volatile war, we just got a rare look at how air power, special operations, deception, risk management, and political signaling all collide in real time. And if this war keeps going, that collision is probably not a one-off, it is a preview.